Be quiet.
There's a bit thin on the ground tonight.
I've had 3 or 4 emails from people all saying that they're very keen to hear what Tony's got to say, but they've got other things on tonight.
Yes, I've had a couple that say that please can it be recorded, you know, because I really would like to see it.
So, yeah, I've actually managed it by the skin of my teeth, having been down to Middlesbrough today. So.
Right.
Yeah, I know Lindsay said he was tied up.
So, so you're on candid camera, you're being recorded, Tony.
Okay.
And I'm sure that those that miss it will all play catch up later.
Yeah. Well, I'm ready to go when you are.
Well,
so.
as long as you're happy with us recording it and putting it up privately on YouTube later.
Yeah, no problem.
Good. Just out of courtesy of just checking. Yeah, it is holiday season with a number of people being away just now.
Is Chris joining us tonight? Do you know? I mean,
Well, he said he was coming home today from holiday.
He's definitely home because he emailed me on a non-railway matter to say he was home.
Yeah, likewise, he emailed me on a matter. Can I just, while we are around, just a couple of tiny bits of business in my on-set role. Can I just remind anybody who has any interest in going to see the Spittal layout that hasn't responded to me to let me know by, say, close of business tomorrow. There's a lot of people here present have responded, and thank you very much for that. I didn't think it was necessary to send back an acknowledgement on an individual basis, but I'll be sort of scratching my head by the end of tomorrow to see how it all fits. We've had quite a lot of response, actually. I think we may have to have 2 sessions down there. The 2 other things very briefly. Last month, you may remember in June when I started off this, I put a sort of miscellany together of useful stuff, interesting stuff, rather than send them around separately. Well, the month has come round, and in a few days' time, I'm going to send the next one out. So if anybody's got any contributions for that, please let me have those next few days. And also, I've been trying to canvass possible topics or speakers for these Zoom sessions going forward into the autumn in particular. And so far, unfortunately, I haven't had much response other than one person here present. So if anybody's got any ideas for a theme or something, please do let me know. But if you can find a speaker to go with it, so much the better. That's it.
That looks very tasty, Chris.
Innocent gun, innocent gun.
You're making me thirsty just watching you.
I'm afraid I'm stuck with squash.
Peculiar.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on the strongest stuff.
I've got one of...
It's a brewer's special, All Peculiar, stronger version.
All the best to you, John. You seem to be the only other one who's raising such a glass.
I've got a glass.
Oh, you've got a glass first.
There's quite a few there.
A bit of a rush to finish a meal tonight, so this didn't.
Well, I'm going to have to put mine on mute and stop video in about 10
Yeah, Richard's still on with his by the looks of it. What are you having, Richard?
Dinner's being brought up.
Salad roll.
I shall have some in the dark, so to speak.
Coffee and Scale 4 Society mug.
Oh, that's very, very good, yes.
Oh, I have one. Yes. And it's quite poor quality because it's obviously an overglazed one, and you know the printing is gradually wearing off.
Yeah, it's the dishwashers. You see that tends to.
That's right. Yeah. We went a few years ago. We went to Georgia, and had a trip around Georgia, including going to Stalin's birthplace and so on, and an exhibition there with his railway carriage and all that sort of stuff. And I bought a mug there, and you know that's now completely white because it was such poor quality overprinting.
My son brought me back a mug from a Pakistani warship, which was rather, and I thought, oh, that's nice, because it was one of the XRN ones. Only to discover that the printing was actually a transfer, and there was no protection on top of the transfer whatsoever. For the first time it was washed,
Off
The
it
whole
came.
thing just washed off.
I'm not supposed to wash them.
Well, yes, it's
Hello, Jim. Evening.
Yeah, hi everybody.
All right.
Oh, well,
Yeah, yes, thank you. Yeah. Thought I'd join
Jim,
because
Jim, don't be entirely surprised if in my honorary secretary role you get an email from me in the next few days, will you? I should
No,
be
not at all.
I'm canvassing you on something, but I'm just trying to work out how nicely to put it, you know.
just
okay, right. So I'll don't
presentation.
well, don't spoil any surprises.
I won't.
Yes, the need for the right word. I've spent the afternoon trying to finish some minutes, which have to be very, very tactful.
That's not like you, John.
Worth kicking off, Fergus, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I'm not sure.
Mr. Summers going to join us this evening?
Sorry, Richard, your mouth was full.
Sorry, Mr. Summers not going to join us this evening.
Okay, then, shall we go?
Yep.
I think the floor's all yours, Tony, so go for it.
Okay, I'll go to share screen and that should bring up. How's that?
Perfect.
Yep.
And
Nothing.
I've got to change that view so I can get the little arrows. Is that right?
yep.
Right. That is the opening slide, but
You need to go to presentation, Tony.
where's that then?
Like a slide screen thing down the bottom. That's assuming you've got one.
No.
Hang on, this is not a PowerPoint.
That's it. How's that? Is that better? Can you all see that?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, right. I think we're all right now because I've got arrows to move the pictures. So welcome and thank you for joining me on this little trip to Blairgowrie. As you will see, real and imagined. I am reading from a script, but I will probably go off piste anyway. But I'm quite happy if anybody's got any comments and questions for you to chip in at any time, because it's probably best to do that as we're going through the presentation rather than tucking it away at the end. I've been researching Blairgowrie for over 50 years. And in the same time, I've been building a model of Blairgowrie. As you will see, it's far from complete. The reality is that the branch line opened in 1855, and my datum year for the model is 1906. So those with degrees in mathematics will work out that's 51 years. I started the model in 1970. So again, with your degree in mathematics, you will work out that the 51 years is up this year. So I can genuinely claim that the Cali have beaten me to finishing it. And it is still far from finished, as you will see. But anyway, let's move on. I'm sure you will all know where Blairgowrie is, but I did put a map in for the benefit of anybody that doesn't. But it was the terminus of a branch line 4.5 miles long from Cooper Angus. The main passenger service to Blairgowrie came from Dundee West here, over the Dundee New Tile route to Blairgowrie. But the goods service always operated from Perth North Yard, up the main line to Cooper Angus and then reverse to go to Blairgowrie. The goods service was the train was always referred to as the Blairgowrie goods. And in Kelly days and probably early LMS, my knowledge doesn't go beyond 1923, I'm afraid. I've been quite ruthless about that. But I probably know what there is to know about the branch in Kelly days, and certainly around the period I've modelled it. And in those days, the Blairgowrie goods served Blairgowrie and Cooper Angus only. There was enough traffic for the Blairgowrie goods just to serve those two stations. And there were 2 goods trains a day, would you believe? And I've seen reports of the goods trains being up to 40 wagons. There's an overall view taken in the 1960s, probably not very close to the closure of the line. This was actually taken by the Scotsman newspaper, but it's a good one because you can see the general layout of the train shed there, the goods shed, loading bank. We come forward, that was another loading bank there. And I think you can just about make out the cattle pens there. Engine shed and where the turntable used to be. These are what I refer to as the new sidings because they were newer than the old sidings or the original sidings. And you can just in the corner there see the roof of the signal box. It's not everybody has got an aerial view of their layout, but I was fortunate enough to be in a position where somebody could take one of it. This is at Keith Bank Mill in 1994. I was invited to exhibit the layout at the Fine Scale Scotland, I think it was called, exhibition. And this is the only time that the whole layout has ever been exhibited in public. But it was quite a good weekend for me because there was quite a lot of local people came along who weren't necessarily railway people. And they were obviously very interested to see the model, and most of them recognised it, although it had been some time since the station had closed. And it did give me some introductions to some quite useful contacts, which I later exploited. The event is also notable because it's the first time I met Jim Summers, and I had the great pleasure of being able to run his open bogie on there. On the layout while it was at Keith Bank. We'll come back to open bogies later on. That's a more recent view of the model as it is at the moment. But if you remember back, we'll go back a couple of slides there. The way I've modelled it is from the engine shed going back that way to the station is pretty well to scale, which is what you see in that slide coming up. Going out to the Cooper Angus end, I've contracted or squeezed it up a lot, changed some of the curves, and that was really so I was able to get it to go round into around an L shape into a fiddle yard at right angles to the station. So there are some changes at the outer end, and that's a more, this is quite an old general view, but you will see that the angles and the layout is not quite as it was in the aerial photograph you see, but the general characteristics are there. I also had to miss out 2 of these long new sidings as well, but that was purely for the length required to get the point working. Right, now I'm sure there are people that are going to be asking, why Blairgowrie? And the answer to this is actually quite complicated. But it really started off with this article in the Railway Modeller in 1967 by George Russell. Mm-hmm. And at that time, George Russell was the Caledonian steward for the Historical Model Railway Society. And later became chairman and is now president of the Caledonian Railway Association. But I contacted George after this article because he'd used Blairgowrie here as his Auchinwraith station. Although the model itself was set in George's native Lanarkshire, he used Blairgowrie for Auchinwraith station. And if we move to the second page of the article, you will see the Blairgowrie buildings again there. And to be able to put it in context, there's the real thing in 1960s. We'll come back to the station buildings and my models of them. But that was just to explain my introduction to it, because in his article, George described Blairgowrie as a modeller's dream and said it could be built on a baseboard 14 inches wide. And I really sort of took that to heart and had, as I mentioned before, I had a lot of contact with George. I put a request for information in the Railway Modeller at the time and had some very interesting people who I would describe as worthies, and most of those are still about now, and knew awful lot more about the Caledonian Railway probably than I ever will do. But that really got me even more interested I would already been interested in the Caledonian, and really had this concept of building a model of real Caledonian station, and had been looking through the system for a suitable prototype. And Blairgowrie coming up in George Russell's article really gave me a cue, and with the responses I got from the other people, I was really hooked on Blairgowrie. Just coming back to this is a view from the same vantage point, but this is more recent one, and is only of interest because he is a rake of true line models all waiting for their new transfers, which some of you may or may not know about. That's also, I've put that up as a background to a very brief discussion about Proto 4, because at the time I was thinking about building the model of the Caledonian Railway. The first utterings were in the model press, in the model railway constructor and so on, about Proto 4. And that was really just sort of taking off in the south at the time. And I got involved in most of the early London meetings, which eventually led to the formation of the P4 Society. It was no accident that I helped out on the studio lift stand at the first appearance of Proto 4 in Scotland at the McClellan Galleries in 1971. Now, for those that don't remember, Studiolith was the original sole supplier of components to P4 standards. And it was mainly due, in fact, to the failure of Studiolith to deliver on the various promises that have been made to Proto 4 Society members, that a lot of people, in fact, got disillusioned with P4. And this eventually led to the formation of the Scale 4 Society, the ultimate demise of the P4 Society, and also the demise of the unrealistic concept of a single supplier for P4 goods. I mean, the one thing the Scale 4 Society did do was provide an opportunity for a lot more people to come onto the market with P4 components and so on. But anyway, back to Glasgow in 1971, and I got to meet a lot of Scots who at that time were interested in P4, but had not really seen it. And what emerged from that, and this was my contribution to the West of Scotland group, was that the West of Scotland group did come out of that. And it was originally started by a guy called Ian Campbell, who Alan Goodwillie and I exchanged memories of before, and nobody has any contact with him anymore. But Alan did describe me once as being a founding member of the West of Scotland group. And I did point out to him, I've never been a member of the West of Scotland group, but I did have a small hand in founding it with the contribution at Glasgow show. Anyway, enough of the nostalgia and the modelling politics. Let's move back onto the model. He says, let his script catch up with his mouth. This is a background to another little bit, background picture to another bit of background information. I'm a Southerner, if you hadn't already guessed by my accent, and I can claim with some certainty that I don't have a single drop of Scottish blood in my makeup. I've researched my family genealogy on all branches back to the first English census of 1841, and I'm mostly Kentish, with just a spot of Surrey and Birmingham for my mother's side. So that's my origins. However, as an Englishman brought up in the suburbs of South London, the challenge of researching and building a model of a station in Scotland and in a Scottish country town, because I was a city boy really, really was quite a fascinating and irresistible idea. And I already had a prototype to get interested in Blairgowrie, and as things developed, Blairgowrie did turn out to be a wonderful choice. Not only was the station interesting to model, but as my knowledge of the station and the town and the traffic developed, I discovered what a real gem it was. It truly was George Russell's modeller's dream, and has for me turned out to, I don't know, it's probably an understatement to say it's been a modeller's dream, but it's fulfilled all my expectations many times over. I put this photograph up to whet your appetite because it says a lot of Blairgowrie. This was taken in 1921. And at the time, Blairgowrie was the third largest town in Perthshire after Perth and Crieff. And they used to say at that time that everything and everybody that went in and out of Blairgowrie went via the Caledonian Railway. And as you can see, it's a pretty busy place. Yeah, the only exception to that rule was apparently that the sheep went to market in Perth by road. But there we are. Right, we'll get on to look at some of the models now then. I'll just come back to that one. We had a look at that one before. Ah, right, hang on. I'm just going to go back a slide there. I'll put that up again as a background to a bit of explanation. I really have to issue some consumer warnings at this point in time. Firstly, to say that Blairgowrie was never conceived as an exhibition layout, and consequently, I've never had the incentive or the pressure necessary to get it completed. And not only completed, but working to a satisfactory standard for public display. The absence of that incentive has allowed me to adopt a rather complacent attitude to finishing my models. Most of what you will see tonight does need some degree of finishing. The other reason for this state of affairs is that I'm not really a finisher, and I have a tendency to get interested in a new project before the last one's finished. So therefore, my Blairgowrie plays host to a whole bundle of unfinished projects. But anyway, we'll explore that as we go along. The next warning I have to give is to confess that I'm a builder of models rather than a player with trains. Everything on Blairgowrie does work and works well within the limits of my Stone Age track and baseboards. But it's only operated very occasionally and usually either to test something new or to entertain visitors. And I don't think I've ran train. There's some new photographs that my son took. And sorry, I should have missed I missed an opportunity to thank my son, because he was my collaborator in the exhibition at Keithbank Mill, and he also took some of the more recent photographs that you'll see tonight, and this is one of his. Right, that's a couple of things. My third warning is really a confession. Apart from a couple of notable exceptions, I've built everything you see myself. A lot of it is not up to the high standards that I've got used to seeing in magazines and journals, and more notably on YouTube and whatever these days. And I'm very envious of the quality of some of the modelling I see. And I'm never going to be able to match that, and a lot of what you see doesn't match it. But however, against that, I can pitch to you that I have a unique model railway that's kept me entertained for a very long time and continues to do so. And it pleases me, at least, even if I'm not always satisfied with the quality of some of the work I do. But I'll let you be your own judges of how well I've portrayed Blairgowrie and the Caledonian Railway. Let's see some more. All the original, oh, sorry, I'll just. Oh yeah, I'm just going back and looking at my script because I've gone off piste a bit here. But the main part of it, I'll go back a slide. The main part of the station is on 2 baseboards, each 6 foot long. These are movable in extreme circumstances, but it's not something I want to be doing often. That is the first bit of Stone Age technology that's given me problems over the years. The conventional wisdom at the time for baseboards was to use 1/2-inch chipboard on a 2x1 deal framework. And although originally the idea was to screw the surface quite rigidly to the framework, I've allowed the framework to float on, allowed the chipboard to float on top of the framework. Despite that, the baseboards have suffered from quite a few moves of houses. They've walked, got knocked around, and have expanded and contracted a lot since they were originally built. And the main problem I find is that the baseboard joints now, there's little peaks at each of the baseboard joints where they've walked. Now I think Alan Goodwillie did some work on his layout to resolve those sort of problems, but I've never got round to do that, and I've compensated by that by ensuring that all my engines and rolling stock have got adequate vertical flexibility. And as you would have seen on the curve going round to the fiddle yard, is quite a sharp curve, certainly by prototype standards and even by modern modelling standards. So all the rolling stock needs to have horizontal or lateral flexibility as well. I was reading from my script here, the Achilles heel on the other foot, having mentioned baseboards, is the track work. The original track was built using the Brooks method of ply sleepers and rivets. And most of the original track was built with rivets that came from studio lift. And it was only after about 20 or 30 years that I found that these rivets, which were steel with a galvanized coating, the galvanizing was coming off of them. And that revealed steel rivets. Now, steel rivets are very, very difficult to solder onto, because if you put enough heat on to do it properly with very strong flux and the right solder, it then burns the wooden sleepers. So that's not really a solution in itself. So the only solution I've had to that problem where the rails have lifted is to cyano the track with cosmetic chairs to keep it in place. The curve into the fiddle yard was relayed when we moved here to Norwich, and that does use C&L chair track. And I just put that one up, A, to show you some more modern track, B, to show you some recent attempts at very rough grass, and B, to show you this bridge, which did exist, but it was about a mile farther up the line than it is portrayed in the model. And if you look through the bridge, you can see into the fiddle yard. Coming back to the station, that's an aerial view of the station buildings. Right, just let me, right. I've got 2 copies of the engineer's drawings. The first I obtained from British Rail probably back in about 1969. That was from the district engineer's office when it was in Perth. Does anybody remember any railway offices in Perth apart from the station? As we will see in other photographs, there was an awning sat in front of the first class gentleman's waiting room there. That wasn't shown in the drawing I had from British Rail. But I did subsequently find a reference in the Scottish Records Office to a drawing of that awning, which was dated 1911. And I therefore made the assumption that that was the date it was erected. The date of the model is 1906, so I left it off. A few years later, John Payton of the Caledonian Railway Association, and he is our sort of buildings and civil engineering guru, published an article in the True Line, the Caledonian Association's journal, of some buildings on the Northern District, and he included a description of the drawing of the buildings at Blairgowrie, and published another set of engineers' drawings, which were fundamentally the same as mine, but they did show the awning in place at the time of the 1894 rebuilding, and there is evidence to suggest that it actually predates 1894. So that's something else I got wrong. But there is the awning. And just interestingly to point out, there's a little lever frame there, which operates the engine release crossover. And I'm not sure how that was open, but it was connected with the signal cabin somewhere, either with a key that was given to the engineman or telegraphically, so that you had to have the signalman's permission to open this release crossover. But there's the awning, and beneath this picture there are the awning brackets that I did some artwork for, and Bill Bedford etched me these, so I've got no excuse but to get on and build the awning at some time. Okay, moving on. The station front. As you see, I've got a couple of photographs of buildings with real and model. The station building is built of plasticard, and all the stonework was scribed by hand. Now, I can't say that every individual stone is in exactly the right place, but doing this in this rather laborious way does ensure that you finish up with the correct form of the stonework, and also you get the stonework around the windows and the astragals on the windows, and you know that all comes out correctly. That round space there, that had a station clock. I mean, I could talk about a station clock for 10 minutes, but I won't bore you with that particular tale now. The original After Eights Mints packaging has a clock that is exactly the right size. It has the right format of the numerals on it, and I could live with After Eight on the clock. So I've got several of those, and that will get put on there sometime. The goods shed. That was the original goods shed from 18, and that was the 1894 extension. And there you'll see it in the model. And that building there was the North British Railway goods office. Again, I won't go into too much detail today, but I explored the relationship of the town with the North British Railway in an article I wrote about the rebuilding the station, published in the CRA journal. Here we have the engine shed. That is the only photograph, just to go back a sentence, the engine shed was closed in about 1940 or 41 as a wartime economy measure. And that is the only photograph I've been able to find prior to that date, and still with the rails running into it. Probably that was taken in the day when it would have all been left shut up anyway. But here's my model. I acquired a Caledonian Railway drawing of the engine shed. It's actually about the re-roofing of it, but it does have full details of the structure and dimensions and so on. And that came from Duncan Burton, who some of you will remember. And you know, I knew Duncan quite well in the early days, and was probably in those days was the ultimate source of information on anything Caledonian, and is very sadly missed. The stonework on that was a ratio plastic sheet of the right sort of ashlar format, but very rough. So what I did was just to sand it down to nearly flat, but that does give the right style and that texture to the stonework at Blairgowrie. You might be able to see that there's a join between the two plastic sheets, which is quite conspicuous if you look at it face on. And that will be hidden eventually by a rainwater down pipe that goes down that bit of the building. But anyway, the little pyramids on there, which you see do nearly match the originals. They're from a board game, interestingly. I do have the pairs of doors here, both back and front. Well, sitting in a wagon somewhere, and they'll get put on one day. You can't see a lot of the turntable from here, but in fact, the turntable sits in the model, just in I don't know if it will come up later on. Oh, well, this right. We've moved on to the water tower, but you can see the turntable there in front of the engine shed.
Tony, just before we move on from the engine shed, do we know why it had an arch over the doors, which appears to have been filled in?
No. Well, I don't know. That's the earliest photograph I've got. So whether the actual form was arch or that whether that was just to support the top of the end wall, so that you probably got a metal runner across there that just supports the weight of the infills. I don't know. I'm not a builder, and perhaps a builder could comment on that. But I would guess that arch is to support the main weight of the end wall.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Can I ask, was it the same on both ends?
Sorry?
Was it the same on both ends, Tony?
Pass, but
Right.
probably.
Alloa shed.
I would have to go back to my own photographs in the 1970s to look at the other end of it.
Right. Okay. Because I was going to mention Alloa shed. Alloa shed originally had curved entrances, and due to damage at one end, they repaired it and put on just what you have there with the doors.
Right.
And the other end remained with its arches.
Do you know that's really made? I'll have to go back to the original. I'm sure in the drawings that I built it from, it's shown with those doors. It is. Yes. What I now remember, I did a scale drawing of the engine shed from the Caledonian drawing, and that was the format shown on the Caledonian drawing, which dates from probably about the 1880s. Right, we moved on to the watershed. Water tower. We're going to come back and talk about that. But as you'll see, the turntable was situated in front of the engine shed. That was that was a 42-foot Cowans and Sheldon engine shed, and on the models, which you can see there, is a very simplified version of it, because I always intended to do that properly. And of course, there is a kit for that now available. I think it was Micro Models that did it originally, and it's now with London Road. Mm-hmm. But I do have one of those to build, and so and when I get to doing that, I will install the proper track work into the engine shed. But as you will see from the position of the doors, there's much less than 6 foot spacing between the tracks. It is very, very narrow, and to get the 2 narrow tracks coming off the turntable, there was a V here somewhere. So the track did come off the turntable into a V and separate immediately into the 2 roads into the engine shed. What you may or may not have noticed is that the model turntable is operated manually from a handle on the front of it, which is actually the handle to wind up the clockwork on an old parking meter, and was donated by a policeman friend of mine. We might see that in an article. The water tower is an interesting one because that was the only building I had no information on when I started building the layout, probably because it went at a fairly early date. It is shown on both the Caledonian Railway track plans I've got at Blairgowrie, and from that I was able to estimate its footprint. And at the time, Ratio had a kit of a water tower with a very similar footprint, which was stone, which I assumed the Blairgowrie one would be to match the engine shed, and with an iron tank on the top of it. So the stonework on the Ratio kit had the same treatment as the stonework for the engine shed, like rubbed down nearly to flat. And there it sat on the model for nearly 40 years before I came up with this photograph that you see above the model. And that was taken by Bill Smith on the last day of the passenger service in December 1955. And shock horror, it's built of brick and not stone. And shock horror has a big chimney on the back of it, also built of brick. Otherwise, the ratio is a reasonable representation, and that original model is going to stay put, and I don't plan to replace it with another one. The little bothy there, which was presumably an engineman's bothy, was built by a very good friend and fellow Cali modeler, Dave Lockery, and is apart from the signal box, which we will see shortly, is the only building that I didn't make myself. And in fact, the final one we will look at is the signal box. That's the real thing. As you see, the Blairgowrie sign there, I did see that once. It did get preserved by a guy called Lindsay Horn, who some of you might have known was quite well known in Dundee. And he had it in his garage and he offered it to me for 300 quid. Well, I just didn't have £300 to spare in those days, so I had to let the opportunity go by. But Lindsay died a few years ago, and I'm sure his stuff was all auctioned off. So somebody must have that somewhere. I don't know if we've even got £300 now to spend on it, because it'll only just fill up a space on the wall in here. But there we are. The engine shed that you will see of the model was as a limited edition by Hornby. They did something, I think, on the Kirriemuir branch in the Hornby magazine a few years ago. And I don't know how many of these were made. It is a resin moulding, but I got it via the Caledonian Railway Association, who got their hands on a handful of these things. And although it's not identical to the Blairgowrie signal cabin, if you can imagine that's posed the wrong way around for the purpose of the photograph. But when normal view of it I have is of the back face with the chimney. That's good enough for me. Right, we're going to move on to some engines now. My first engine on Blairgowrie was in 1970 was a Hornby 040 tank engine with a simple scratch built underframe, very nicely painted in Caledonian livery by no less than Chris McCarthy. Do you remember that, Chris?
Only too well, Tony. Only too well.
Do you remember what the name on the tank was?
It was called Nelly.
Do you remember why?
Because your dear wife's maiden name is Nelson.
Correct.
And then Hornby went and copied Nelly, didn't they, later on, for that very same loca about 10 years afterwards?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know if you know this, but unfortunately that got lost. I sent it along with my very first 3 Cully wagons to Eddie Bourne for an exhibition a few years ago of early P4 stuff that he was putting on at Scale Forum, I think. And it got lost in the post. And despite a lot of badgering in the post office, they never found it. So somebody's either got that sat in their mantelpiece or it's gone in somebody's dustbin. Apologies, Chris. I should have looked after your goods a lot better.
Well, they'll clearly be thrilled by the brilliant paintwork.
It was rather splendid, I will say that. But anyway, here's my first real Cali engine. And Chris will know, and some of you might know the name of Len Folkard, who in the early 70s was building quite a reputation as a wizard with plasticard. And I challenged him to build an engine in plasticard. And this is what he came up with. John Boyle, who's, again, some of you may know, and I've known for many, many years until his unfortunate demise last year, or death, I suppose I should have been polite word rather than demise. But he painted this, and back in the 70s, this was considered very speculative Kelly livery. And I think it's gone on to be accepted as the first Drummond livery with the extra chocolate or red, however you want to describe it, panels round the blue. But it does look very pretty, doesn't it? But as you will see, it is plastic. It has suffered the ravages of time. You know, there's a bit of a footstep missing. The underhung springs and hangers are missing now. And just going back a step, when he built the body, the tender body is actually a Triang 123 body that I managed to acquire from somewhere. And it's quite a good representation of the original Drummond bodies on the first series of Drummond Jumbos. But Len Folkard offered to build an underframe from it, but it said it was going to be in plastic hard. So I opted for a metal one instead with rocking beams. And at the time, the in vogue drive mechanism was Sagami motors and Sharman gearboxes. Anybody remember those?
Yeah.
As I come in, I said, age has not been very kind to this, and I did think a few years ago to try and fit a new split frame chassis to it. When I came to inspect the engine, it's so fragile that I decided to leave well alone, and it's normally parked outside the engine shed of Blairgowrie as a static model, and which is where you would have seen it in some earlier photographs. My first scratch built engine was a Caledonian Railway Class 660. And I deliberately chose this because it was relatively easy scratch built in terms of size and style, relatively easy engine to build. Although at the time in the early 1970s, there was nothing like any drawings of these engines. So I used photographs and known dimensions to create a drawing and then for the model. In fact, the tender, as I remember, is plastic hard, but the body is nickel silver. It runs quite well, this engine, although it's been around for a long time. It originally had a Mashima motor, and must have been a very early Mashima motor. Perhaps it was a Sagami and I replaced it with a Mashima. And it was a branch lines multi-box gearbox, which sits quite well down low on the front axle. Now, I did build a new split frame underframe for this a few years ago, and it's got a Mashima motor now in the same gearbox, and added some weight to it. But as you will see from the form of the engine, there's not very much room to get any weight in it, and it will pull a few wagons okay, but not 40 wagon goods train that I mentioned before. The paint job again was done by John Boyle. John Boyle used to do paint jobs for me in exchange for things I did for him. So, you know, because John Boyle was really a 7mm modeler, so it was quite a favour to get into work in 4mm. But I have a set of plates for this. Is number 324, should be on the cab side here. And 324 was the Perth North Yard shunter for many, many years in Caledonian days. And it's quite conceivable that it could have run the Blairgowrie goods on occasion. So it's not unrealistic to put it in Blairgowrie. The inevitable DJH Jumbo, which was the next engine I had to go at. I do have photographs of Jumbos on the Blairgowrie goods, and they were also used on some of the passenger trains from Blairgowrie to the junction at Cooper Angus between goods turns. So they had to be fitted engines, of course, for that. And in the summer fruit season, in fact, dual fitted engines were sent up to Blairgowrie to take away the vacuum fitted English stock that was sent there for the fruit traffic. This has always been a good runner, this engine. It's got Gibson sprung horn blocks in it and a Porter-Scap RG4 motoring gearbox, which are very nice products and go quite well together. Been a bit overtaken by springy beams these days, but in its day that was probably the best arrangement that was available. But I never finished it off, and you'll see it's still not got any front buffers.
You should fall asleep in front of people and sit somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah.
So was there a question there, or was that? Yeah, I never finished this off because, I mean, the DJH castings are not bad, I suppose, by the standard of their day, but they are clumsy compared to etched kits. And I always hoped and expected that somebody would do an etched kit for a jumbo. And I didn't think I would have to wait nearly 40 years for that. But hopefully Lindsay has got something on the way that will prove that my patience has been justified. Oban bogey. I mentioned about open bogies before, very briefly. Open bogies were the mainstay of the passenger service to Blairgowrie in the period I modelled. In fact, the two open bogies were assigned to Blairgowrie branch in 1903 and stayed there at least until the early 20s. And they ran all the trains to and from Dundee and the occasional, what I call local passenger trains down to Cooper Angus and back. They were originally designed for the Cullen and Oban line, and in 1882, and they had the four-wheel tenders because of the short turntables that were available on that line at the time. At the time of my model, 1906, Dundee had 4 of these engines, 2 of which were assigned to the sub-shed at Blairgowrie, and the other 2 were used on the Dundee and Arbroath line. I'll just show you this one because that's another aerial view of a view of Blairgowrie, but that's the only photograph I've got of an Oban bogie at Blairgowrie. I've got several of Oban bogies on trains on the Dundee and Newtile, and there are quite numerous pictures of them working on the Oban line and elsewhere. But again, this one was also taken at about 1921, but we'll mention the name of James Dick later on, but he was the major coal merchant in Blairgowrie, and that was his siding. And as you will see, it's just full of wagons. And again, you can see the format of the station house, the overalls. That was a block of 4 railway cottages for staff, and the station master and a porter were housed in the house here. But yeah, there's a lot more history to these buildings, and that's all covered in the article I wrote for the True Line, if anybody wants a copy of that. Or coming back to the Oban bogies, the only advance I've made onto the model from the original photograph you've seen is to put some motion in it. But they are lovely little engines, and they were ideally suited for the Blairgowrie trains, and the gradients and the sharp curves, really, I suppose, on the Dundee and Newtile line And I was really very pleased when I first discovered that they were the mainstay of the Blairgowrie passenger traffic. But they're the love affair stops, because when you try to build them, they are absolute pigs. And the main problem is with the cylinder penetrating the line of the footplate, which makes the underframe difficult to build, and then also makes the bodywork difficult to build, to combine them in a way that gives any kind of reasonable portrayal of the engines. I have converted all my engines and would build engines now with split frames, and that adds to the problem of doing this. And but I think I have a solution now, and that's based on Steve Duckworth's tender drive system that was used in his Cali 812s, which he built 3 of, and there was an article in Scale 4 News about 3 years ago about these. And I've had lots of exchanges. I've got to know Steve quite well since then. And I've had lots of exchanges with him, and as I say, I think I've got a solution. It just requires a bit of time to activate, really. Instantly, I'll give Steve a plug, because he wrote some very good notes on his Somerset and Dorset engines using his drive system, which were included in the Missenden Abbey virtual autumn weekend last year. And you know, that is publicly accessible. So if you have any difficulty, come back to me and I'll tell you how to get onto it. But that's well worth looking at. I just included this because, as I say, did I talk about crossheads in a previous meeting? So that's how my fabricated crossheads look now. Okay, moving on. Next engine. The Blairgowrie passenger service from Dundee required the 2 open bogies, which were scheduled at Blairgowrie, but there was a third engine required, which ran an afternoon return train from Dundee. And that was, again, in my period, was usually hauled by one of these 670 class 042s. Now, these are very interesting engines in their own right. And again, I did write an article about them for the Caledonian True Line. But anyway, this was my second scratch-built engine, again without a drawing. And although there was a published drawing of the 1840-gallon tender behind another engine that was. Can't remember who the drawing was by. Like all my engines, this got a new split axle frame, underframe, a few years ago. And for that, I used a spare etch from Jim Smiley of Cali Coaches. He has had a Class 670 kit on his catalogue for about 20 years. And he's only ever got as far as his catalogue until I think about 2 years ago, and he finally released the kit. Although the problems that prevented him from offering it before then weren't resolved, but they are pointed out in the kit and the solutions. But anyway, my version of his chassis features rocking beams and the Mashima motor and a high-level load hauler gearbox. And there is plenty, because it's quite a high boiler, there's plenty of room for weight in this engine. And it does live up to the load hauler expectation of the name of the gearbox. Right, engine next. The inevitable Macintosh tank. The usual DJH tank. Macintosh tanks were not used regularly on Blairgowrie services until the 1920s, and probably not until after the grouping. but there were a number of Dundee in the early 1900s, and they were used on other branch services. So I've imagined that, excuse me, one could have got to Blairgowrie in my period as a relief for the regular engine. Again, this has a scratch-built split underframe with rocking beams, Mashima motor and branch line multi-box gearbox. It's quite heavy, as you would expect, and will haul 4 or 5 bogie carriages with ease. And this is the only tank engine I ever likely to model. The advantage was that fitting a DCC module was quite easy because there was space in the side tank for it. I think it's an opportunity to explain that I did convert all my engines to split axle format to improve their operation on my less than perfect track. And moving to DCC was also part of my attempts to improve operation, although, as we've already decided, I'm not a player of trains. But this was also encouraged by my acquisition of Mike Gilgannon's Lentz DCC system when that came up, when that was auctioned off after his unfortunate death, and which I suppose must be 10 years ago. But I did install all that on Blairgowrie very quickly after I acquired it, and it all works quite well. And I have 2 controllers on long flexible leads. One covers the station area and the other the fiddle yard, and you can drive the whole model from either of those or split it between. But one of the things I did keep for operational purposes was the original section arrangements. So there we are. Right, we'll move on to some rolling. Does anybody want a break at that stage? Or shall I carry on? Carry on?
Yeah, keep going, Tony.
Okay. Right, these are my original set of Caledonian carriages. When I built these way back in the early 70s, the only source of any carriages with any kind of realistic panelling to them was trying GWR clerestory carriages, and these are built from those. In fact, it was George Russell who worked out how to make a reasonable semblance of Caledonian carriages, and I've still got his handwritten notes of how to do it. The brake compo at the end here is quite a jigsaw to do, as any model of Caledonian carriages will know, because the 2 sides are not mirror images. They're quite different, but anyway, the only way I was going to get any real Caledonian carriages was to start scratch building them. So I started off with some NPCS, I should say, non-passenger coaching stock. And these are 3 of my very early vehicles. And anybody with eagle eyes will see that I got the Drummond panelling on the fish fruit milk van totally wrong, and the lower body side panel is actually inset rather than outside the bottom. But the only information I had on these at the time was the drawing, and I wrongly interpreted the drawing. Coming back to this many years later, I was quite impressed with those louvers, and I seem to remember I made those by scribing with a hacksaw blade. They look quite good though, don't they? Though I say it myself. That is a scratch-built horse box, not a Spratt and Winkle kit, which I did build another one with a Spratt and Winkle kit. Right. That is my first rake of Drummond 6-wheelers. And I'll show you these two from the rake as they show my early attempts at lining, and that was done with a mapping pen and acrylic gouache paint, which I thought was quite good in those days. And the crests are hand painted, nothing like transfers in those days. That's a photograph of a carriage body, just to show the basic plasticard technique, which will probably be familiar to most of you. I never got on with forming tumble homes on bodies, and all these six-wheelers are built with a solid box with the tumble home sanded into it, and then the drum and panelling in this case applied on top of that. So you do finish up with a very solid box, and in those carriages you saw earlier on are over 50 years old now, so they've stood the test of time. This is actually that lavatory composite that is a later vehicle, but that was actually about the last painting job that John Boyle did for me. And on the later carriages he painted for me, he used black undercoat, and then with the application of the precision paints purple brown, it gives a very dark purple brown. And I think, Alan, you use this on your carriages, don't you, black undercoat?
I have done that in the past, and I've built rakes of Cali carriages, John Boyle's kits, for Cali members. I don't have any Cali carriages myself because I'm all either NB or XL and ER stuff and BR period. But I have actually built. It might surprise quite a lot of people that have built quite a lot of Cali stuff in the past. I'm just thinking of all the. You keep mentioning people, Tony, that go right back to my earliest days, like George Russell. Now, I haven't met George Russell for ages and ages and ages, but he was on the committee at one time for the association when I was on the committee way back in the 1970s, you know. But a real interesting character. I always liked George.
Oh yeah, well, he is still about and enjoys.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he must be into his sort of late 80s now, and he still goes along to the Caledonian Railway Association AGMs when we're able to hold them.
Yeah.
And he sold off all his models many years ago.
Yeah.
But he still writes in the Caledonian Journal occasionally on mostly on Lanarkshire and Lanarkshire mine topics, because that's it really his area, especially. Yes, but as you say, a very nice and very interesting man to talk to.
He's extremely knowledgeable.
My comment was really aimed at Alan Ferguson, because I know he's painted Cali carriages. I don't know if he's still there and wants to comment on that. Maybe he's gone. Okay, moving on. This is a 1970s, I think it's a Metro Camel, tri-composite originally. This was an early John Boyle etch, which was single side etch with no underframes or anything like that. So you had to cut all the windows out, but it makes up quite a nice model. And that was one of the few models I did get to finish the interiors and put in glazing. Yeah, so that's got a scratch built under frame. That's another. I as I say, I have a long history with John Boyle, but I think I used to get a lot of his attempts to convert his 7mm artwork into 4mm etches. I used to get a lot of them for trial builds, and I did build this one. I've never ever seen another one of these in 4mm scale, but it's quite nice with a roof rack and that. And John did actually paint this for me after I made it. but I made quite a few of these in 7mm for John as well. So that was the tip.
Tony, did you ever get any of John Boyle's zinc kits, which he did before the etching?
No, the zinc kits came from Philip Millard.
With the fills, right?
Oh, coming on, there's one of them there.
Right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that was Philip Millard, and
Right.
Again, I suppose this was the early days of the Caledonian Consortium, so it must have been the early 80s. And Philip Millard, under the Red Rose Models banner, was doing London Northwestern and West Coast joint stock, and they were single etches. And I've had this composite a long time because it's a vehicle that John Boyle never did in his own range, but it is essential to the Blairgowrie sets, which the standard combination was 2 brake thirds and the composite. And I mean, I've had the brake thirds for many, many years, but it never made up the set because there didn't seem to be any hurry to replace the old trying carriages. But last year was a good year to be doing things out in the garden, and I did sit out in the garden for many hours, piercing saw and filing out the windows on this, which was a bit of a pain, but it come up as a nice model in the end. So yeah, that's my new rake of 45 footers. Yeah, the 2 brake thirds and all the underframes come from John Boyle's decent models range. Now,
I think Tony Philip also did some stuff for London, Chatham and Dover. I think it was him that did that, because I've also got some zinc ones, although I've only got one side left. I lost one of the sides many years ago. I have made some up in the past, and they do look quite nice, don't they, when they're properly done, and they're very rigid and nice and sharp in their moulding. I was very impressed with them, except you do have to cut the damn windows out.
Well, a case in point is this next vehicle, which is a Philip Millard etch.
Yes, we do actually have some, Tony, running on Burnt Island.
Right.
We have a very early train load. The Roger Pedricks, originally, he put them together, but they're Millard's zinc carriages as well.
Well, this is this started off as a Millard etch of a West Coast joint stock composite, and when the West Coast joint stock was upgraded, I think around about 1895, and the Caledonian acquired quite a few of these composites as part of the distribution of the old West Coast stock to the owning companies. I think that Cali had about 7 or 8 of these, but anyway, 3 of them they converted into slip carriages by joining the luggage compartment, this end compartment, and making that into a guard's compartment and knocking some end windows in, which you can't see in the photograph. But that was what I had for my slip carriage for Blairgowrie, because the vehicle it should have been was a 65-foot Grampian style. Slip brake compo was the carriages that are actually used for the slip carriage working. But back in the 80s, building one of those in plastic hard seemed a bit daunting. So this was a quick fix, really. But of course, the correct vehicle is now included in Jim Smiley's Caledonian Coaches range. So I do have one of those, and that's another one joining the ever-increasing queue outside the works. But that was an interesting one to do, and that's just got a scratch building with the correct ratio, bogies and so on. Right, I just put that one in really to show my original horse box, scratch built horse box alongside the Spratt and Winkle one. So they don't look that different, do they?
Pretty good.
On to wagons. That's 3 of my very early Cali wagons. long before 51L. I don't think 51L started making their Kelly wagons until mid-80s or even later than that. And these were built in the 70s with plastic card. But I mentioned Len Folkard earlier on, and I think he was the one back in the early 70s who pioneered the concept of embossing bolt heads into plastic card, slicing them off with a single-edged razor blade and then applying them one by one, which I think is now become the kind of norm. But that was quite revolutionary in those days because people just left off the bolt heads. And I included that one just to show these early wagons, you know, and they don't look bad. And I was really quite pleased with that photograph because that's an old K's brake van, which was the only Kelly wagon you could buy from the trade when I started modelling. And it wasn't until I put this photograph up for them, I noticed there was a spring missing off. Goodness knows where that's gone. But as you will see, you know, there's lots of other carriage stock and stuff. There's a full brake there and the West Coast joint fish van. You know, yeah. If I showed you everything, I'd be here all night. These are the most recent scratch-built wagons I have built, which are two MB Jubilee wagons with dumb buffers. The 51L do a kit for the spung buffer version, but these are destined for Blairgowrie private owners. The way I've done the rivets on these, I've actually punched them out of 10 thou plastic card with, I think, a 0.3mm, just a bit of wire and a punch. And you just gather up all the little punch-ins and stick them on. Although my eyesight and dexterity are quite not what they used to be when I built these. But again, you know, there were very limited drawings and photographs of all these things in those days. These probably date from the early 70s. Now, Blairgowrie had at least 6 coal merchants who were running their own wagons around the time of my mill. And this is just 3 of them. I'll put these up because that's a conversion from ratio kit. I think that's another conversion from a ratio kit, and that's a ratio kit as well. But you can get quite a good representation of Scottish private owner wagons by using and adapting these kits. And I did write up an article on this at some point in time. But yeah, the other interesting to note is that they are hand lettered, and I just, there's no way I could manage that these days to that kind of standard. So I'm really glad I've got those, and I did that when I could. James Dick was the largest of the coal merchants, and when we had the aerial photograph, I showed you his siding there. But this is 3 wagons representative of the sort of thing he used to run. Number 45 is the only one I've got photographic evidence for, and that was built by Pickering's in 1903, I think. And he's painted and lettered as per that photograph. That one is based on a Peter Matthews. Does anybody remember Peter Matthews and his articles on private owner wagons in the Model Railway News? Mm. And he did cover James Dick, and that's based on the drawing he had there. And that's an ex-railway wagon which James Dick did acquire a number of second-hand railway wagons, so that's one of those. Right, move on to some more recent things. These are London North Western fruit vans from about the 1870s. The interesting thing about these that you can't see in the photograph is that they actually have louvered ends as well. But now I got on to talking with Ross Burns about these, and he very kindly made these parts on his silhouette cutter for me. And, you know, I put them together on a scratch built underframe using Ambis etchings and blah, 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 blah. But I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but I put these together with Limonene, and it stained the plastic off for some reason. Now these were assembled when I was staying away in Yorkshire, and so I just have to blame the Yorkshire water or something.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I've used a lot of dialuminine and never ever found it staining the card.
Really? Well, I mean, I've got to spray these with white undercoat anyway, or you know, the panel bit of it. So it's no great problem. As I say, there is a lot of stuff kicking around. That's a very old Gidenko kit of a London Northwestern fruit van. And I've got another one of these to build. Probably these things were designed and made before P4 was ever heard of, so it makes no allowance for them whatsoever. But this is two of the Cali covered carriage tracks that we did as two-line models, and on a very nice custom designed and made underframe by Ian Terrell. And we were all very pleased with those, and they did come up nicely. That's a John Boyle kit of a Caledonian fish fruit milk van. Interesting that John designed it for the doors to be opening, which is quite a novel feature, I suppose. But when you think about it, it does pose some quite difficult problems with painting, because you're going to have to take the doors and paint them separately, aren't you? But there we are. So I've got another one of those to make up as well. Couple of more recent vans. That's just a two-line models diagram 3 Drummond van. Nothing very special about that, but that one's quite special because this is another John Boyle etch, and what we think he did this from is a drawing of some West Coast joint stock meat vans that the Caledonian built for the West Coast joint stock in the 1870s. And when the West Coast joint stock was upgraded with passenger standard braking, they didn't bother to put that on those, and they came back to the Cali, and they were probably relegated to meat traffic in goods trains. And I've portrayed it as relegated to an ordinary goods van now. So it's interesting to have an ordinary goods van with passenger panelling. Right, there's not a lot more to go, but that's I've been working on another jumbo before Lindsay got involved in jumbo, and I just put that in because that's representative of my current standards in underframes with springy beams, split axles, and properly jointed side rods. Yeah, and that you know, that has obviously got a module attached to it there, so that's the ECC, and that actually runs quite well with no weight in it whatsoever. So I'm really quite pleased with that. I've actually already built the tender for this as well, but this will probably never get finished now. Sorry, let me start again. It was to go with a Worsley Works etch. I don't know if anybody's come across those, which is literally an etch with no castings or components or anything in it. And the etches are fairly basic, but I suppose it's really an aid to scratch building. So I built the tender for this already, but I doubt if the engine will ever get built because it's been overtaken by Lindsay's project. Right, we'll finish up with this. This is obviously a Connor 240, and this engine has quite a long story, but about 20 years ago, John Ball and I decided there was probably a market for a 4mm kit for a Connor 240. So John shot down some of his 7mm artwork to 4mm, and I made a set of patterns to go with the artwork, and we thought we will put them together and sell them as a kit. And I made up the first set of etchings that we had, and it was an absolute nightmare. Took me months to build this. And then we got discouraged by the fact that we had some test castings done, and we were going to get them done in lost wax. They were going to cost £80 an engine. So, you know, we both gave up the ghost at that point in time. So that's as well be, and you could have finished up a very, you know, just a one-off, very nice engine. But when I put the body and the underframe together, the wheels just will not go around in the splashes because it's such a tight fit. And the only way I've got of relief in that situation, these are 6'2" wheels in the prototype, is to put 6-foot wheels in to see if that works. And I've got some Gibson brass 6-foot wheels to try in it. Interestingly, the crosshead was a very much adapted Markets nickel silver casting, which is quite a nice piece of work if you can get a hold of them. And just to finish off, there's the real thing, 11A at Dundee West. Now that particular engine was not scrapped until 1910. So again, it's feasible that it could have run to Blairgowrie, probably as a relief passenger train or on a special or something like that. So A, I have evidence for them being at Dundee West, and B, I have a story for it to get to Blairgowrie. And here I rest my case. Thank you, gentlemen, for listening.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Stunned into silence.
Still looking at this photograph.
It's a lovely wee thing, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it certainly is. I went to art college in the 60s at Dundee, and used to at night time go down to the yards, and I had permission to go around and draw and make sketches and so on in the entrance shed. It was quite an atmospheric place, but wish I'd seen it when the engines looked like this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was saying the difficulty I had with making the wheels go around inside the splashes, and if you look visually at the clearances there, they are bloody tight, aren't they?
Yeah.
Even on the real thing, you know. So if you translate that into model with all the problems you've got of tolerancing and then trying to build them as I am with a lot more flexible movement than the prototype probably had vertically and laterally, you can understand why it's been a problem.
We produced a kit for the Highland Railway medium goods quite a few years ago now, and it suffered almost exactly the same problems, in that it was a nightmare to put together because of the way that the original was put together, really.
Yeah.
I think any of these sort of crew framed locomotives, wherever they come from, are a nightmare. I mean, I haven't heard of a single person who's ever built one from any railway that had this design that hasn't almost thrown it in the bin in disgust, I have to say.
Yeah, Simon de Souza's made 2 or 3 that will actually run on P4 track.
Yeah.
I can only claim to have made ones that run on narrow gauge track.
I do remember having this in my hand many years ago, when Tony first put it together, and sticking my fingers in my ear about his cursing and swearing about the occurrences, and having sort of looked at it closely upside down, he's right.
Yeah, so I know Jim Summers had got a set of these etches, and I just got a feeling that Ross Burns has got one. I don't know where he managed to acquire them, but there can't be more than a handful of them about. I've got another one here, I will confess, and I mean, if I can make this one work, I might well be encouraged to make another one. But they're so pretty, though, aren't they?
Got a good excuse, Tony, that by the end of its life, it must have worn its tyres down quite a bit.
Oh yeah,
you know, you can rescue 2 or 3 inches, surely.
Yeah. Oh, to go to 2 inches undersize is probably about the limit, I think.
I think that's probably about right.
Yeah. Here we are then. So how do I get out of here now then?
Stop screen share.
Yeah.
I've done it for you, Tony.
Okay.
Done.
That was absolutely fascinating. Did I see what looked like a Highland birdcage 6-wheel brake van in brass, the thing at one stage?
Ah, that is another John Boyle etch, and that is actually an Edinburgh and Glasgow
Right. Okay.
brake van. Yeah, with a
birdcage.
So I've still not got out of this yet. How do I do that?
It's a good out of it as far as we're concerned, because we're not seeing any screen sharing.
No.
Oh, well, I can still hear you, so that's not a problem anyway.
You should see a stop screen share up the top of your screen, Tony.
Well, we obviously have.
Well, I stopped it, but it's not stopped in Tony's machine.
Ah, got it. That was just closing the file with the presentation. Oh well, there we are. So as I apologise before, a lot of it's 90% finished, but there he is.
Did you never buy any of Ian Middleditch's Model Wagon Company, Cali?
Oh yes, there's quite a lot of those on here.
Yeah.
But he only ever did 2 Cali ones, to the best of my knowledge. He did the Diagram 46 8-ton mineral, and he did a 7-ton bogey as well, which was quite a nice kit. I've got samples of both of those, but did he do a Cali van? I'm not sure.
Yes, he did, because I've had them in the past. I've actually given all mine away over the years, but I've got quite a few of Ian's Cali vans.
You got to a cattle truck as well.
Yes.
Yeah, you saw a rake of cattle wagons on the railway there. That they are all Ian Middleditch's kits.
Yeah.
Mostly Cali, and I think there's an MB and a Highland one.
That's correct.
As well, yeah.
I did the 3 types.
Yeah.
Paul Tasker's been trying to put together a sort of definitive list, and I put him in touch with Ian Middleditch a couple of years ago now. So I don't know whether the pair of them have got any further with it. But, even Ian didn't know exactly what he'd done.
Yeah, I think there was something about that on the Cali website as well. And I'm sure I got an old catalogue of Ian's here somewhere. I've got all sorts of stuff hidden away here.
Ian produced white metal chairs very early on.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and all the West Group all had their railways fully chaired. And it was a 4-bolt chair, which was suitable certainly for the NB, for myself. And I'm assuming Cali did the 4-bolt as well, didn't they? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, I think they were mostly 3-bolt, but I don't know if there were 4-bolt chairs on the main lines or something like. There was perhaps some differentiation.
Yeah. He could only produce them along with a Cali van. So that's one of the reasons why I know it was on the same casting, you know.
Right. Was that a standard 10-ton van he did then?
Yes, I think it was. Yeah.
Because 51L did that as well eventually, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, there's another interesting story there that when Peter Heald had 51L, and he actually approached the Caledonian Railway Association, and another interesting story here. If you don't mind being bored by Caledonian stories, but anyway, I think John Boyle got involved, and he gave him some good castings of Caledonian components like the axle boxes and springs and that, and they were used in the original 51L kits. But let me go back a step. Does anybody here remember the Caledonian Consortium that predated the Caledonian Railway Association? Is something that Mike Gilgannon and I set up in the 1980s. Yeah,
I mean, they are still. I know the Cali Society are still producing some of Mike's castings for springs and axle boxes and so on.
Well,
still being done, is it not?
Well, yes. A quest I undertook for a long time was to try and find out where the original patterns for those castings went, because we had a whole series of castings for wagon and carriage underframe components.
Yeah.
And I chased them up through Peter Heald and 51L, and then to Chalbank Castings, where some of them went, and blah blah blah. I pretty well went all around the castings industry trying to find out where they went, and got nothing out of that at all. And I'm sitting here one morning, and there's a knock on the door, and it's a postman, and I don't know, I think it was Jim Pearman, who some of you will know, had sent me a package to say, what are these? And they are actually the original, Mike Gilgannon's original patterns, which I now have here. You know, and I spent about 20 years searching for those. The one we have missing, and I think I know where it is now. Some of you may know of Peter James, who was a Cali modeler. He lived in Winchester. He was absolutely first class modeler. I mean, he was, you know, of Mike Gilgannon's standard, and he was the chap that was actually behind the original horse box kit that Spratt and Winkle did that London Road now got. And I think he had quite a hand in the artwork for that, and certainly did the patterns for the castings. But he did us a pattern for the Caledonian Fox's carriage bogie. And that's the one pattern I've got missing. And I think John Boyle had that at some time, and it went to one of his casters. And it's a chap in Carlisle, and I can't get up there to chase after that at the moment.
Tony, you should have joined our illustrious group about 15 years earlier. Jim Pearman is a member of this group, and had you mentioned it, he'd have probably come up with them, a decade ago.
Oh, well, yeah, I was still in regular contact with Jim Pearman through Caledonian things, of course.
Jim watches these recorded sessions, although he doesn't come on live, so I'm sure he will get the message if he watches this.
Yeah. No, it was, it was just, I've been searching for these things for so long, and they suddenly appear before you, don't they? You know.
What are you going to do with them now you've got them, though, Tony?
Oh, yeah, but now the question is, what do you do with them?
Oh, yes, exactly.
Those castings are absolutely superb.
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah,
useful
one
for lots
seems
of other,
good.
particularly
Sierra.
springs and the buffers and things are useful for all sorts of other railways.
Well,
There'll certainly be a market for the springs.
The two original casts that were done for those patterns were done by Sutherland casters, which is why we went to Chalbent, because Chalbent bought all Sutherland's patterns when they gave up. And I wondered if the patterns had gone to Chalbent with the moulds, and so because what one expects the patterns to go with the moulds, but what I found is in the industry that's not necessarily the case. And although the moulds get transferred over from manufacturer to manufacturer, people tend to hold on to the original patterns because they're probably of more value than the moulds, really, because the moulds wear out, but the patterns don't if they're well looked after. So if anybody comes across the pattern for the Caledonian bogey, I would be well pleased to get hold of that one.
So I have to say, Tony, I found that fascinating, catching up on Blairgowrie after all those years and seeing where you got to, and reminding us of the sort of timeline of how modelling in 4mm and P4, but not particularly P4, but how it's changed over the years. Some of us who are ticking the calendar a bit faster than others can relate to a lot of that stuff, and indeed some of the names of those suppliers and so on. Although I've never been a Cali person, but having been around the corner from you, so to speak, at that time, I remember it very, very well.
So are you still modelling London, Chatham and Dover?
No, I'm afraid I gave that up quite a long time ago, and these days I do immediately sort of post-war, late 40s, early 50s, in West Devon, the sort of southern on the LSW section, and the Great Western. So sort of in the Plymouth hinterland. That's my interest these days, for all sorts of reasons of accident as much as anything else, frankly. I still have a sort of half an interest in the southeastern and Chatham, but not a modelling interest really these days.
Well, if I can be permitted to blow my own trumpet for a few more minutes, because one of the things that, I've obviously acquired lots of information about Blairgowrie over the years, and one of the things I've tried to do is to make sure that's in the public domain by publishing articles in the Caledonian Railway Journal. And there are articles on various aspects of Blairgowrie, like the coal trade and the fruit trade and the stationery building, etc., in there. And Jim Summers asked me not very long ago why I hadn't written a book on Blairgowrie, and I probably could have done, but Neil Ferguson beat me to it in his book on the Dundee and Newtile, which includes the Blairgowrie and Ayliffe branches. And I don't know how many of you have got that or seen that, but most of what's on Blairgowrie in that came from me, and he does give me appropriate credit for that. And a lot of the Blairgowrie photographs are credited to me. And I'll just finish up this little piece with two things. About 8 or 9 years ago, there was a group of people got together in Blairgowrie to write a social history of the town. And they actually approached me to write a chapter on the railway station because I knew more about the railway station than anybody in the town. So that book was published with my chapter on the railway and the railway station. And the other thing I will add to that is that since signing up to do this, I've also been invited to do a webinar presentation on Blairgowrie for the CRA in November, but I'm going to concentrate more on the historical stuff than on the model stuff as I did tonight, because as you probably gathered, I could talk about Blairgowrie until the cows come home. But there we are, yes. So blowing my own trumpet for the articles that are already being published in the True Line, and for this presentation in November, if any of you got that access to that. Okay, that's it. I've done.
Thank you very much, Tony.
I
Thoroughly enjoyed that.
Silence says it
Oh,
all.
no. It's brought back to me certainly an awful lot of nostalgic moments going way back, and different people that I knew. As you mentioned things, I kept thinking of various contacts over the years. We all rely very much on people keeping things, sometimes just in their memories. But you can get little keys sometimes that open locks, and suddenly you realize, oh, right, that's what that looked like. I've had lots of instances myself of that. I had a really nice one time. We were at St Andrew's show with my Dubbyside layout, which dates from the same time as your layout, and one of the buildings on Dubbyside is a model of the Harbour Master's office. A very strange and unusual building. And I had taken photographs of it, so I knew I'd made it fairly accurately. And there we were showing it off at St Andrews, and this young fellow came up and he said, "Oh, that's the Harbour Master's office at Kirkcaldy." He said, "Am I right about that?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I wanted to include it on Dubbyside." I said, "Very interesting building and quite unique." And I said, "Did you know it well?" He said, "Oh yes, my father used to work in it." It turned out his father was the harbour master. And I said, "Oh, I'd really like to have met your father." I said, "There's so many questions I would like to ask him." He says, "Oh, well, he's here." So he went and got his dad, and his dad came over, and we were talking about the building. And I said, "How long were you there?" And he said, "Oh, I've been harbour master for 12 years there." And I said, "Very strange and interesting building. This very odd bit that's on the top that looks out to sea. What was that used for?" And he said, "Oh, I never went upstairs." In 12 years, he hadn't gone upstairs to see what was upstairs. He said, "I have no idea what that bit was for." And I thought, "Oh, right, okay." So I've never modelled the interior of it.
No, I mean, I can carry on chuntering around if you want to listen, but remember the Keith Bank Mill exhibition in 1994?
Yes, I was going to say I might have some photographs, Tony, that I took back then.
Have you got some? Yeah, I did.
I'll have a look.
I have probably got some of my own, but where the hell they are, I don't know. And my son might have them, but he didn't have a chance to look them out. The ones I've gotten, there's about 4 or 5, of which the overhead view was one of them. I think were taken by Mike Gilgannon. And Jim Summers passed those to me when they were clearing out Mike's stuff. But yeah, I think one of the most valuable contacts I got at Keith Bank Mill was a lady came up to me and introduced herself, called May Simpson. And she was the daughter of one of the station masters at Blairgowrie. He was there in the 1940s. But she'd worked at the station as a goods clerkess, as they called them, herself, and until the station closed. And she was a fantastic source of information because she had a wonderful memory of the station, and you know, on a plan was actually able to point out to me which length of each siding each coal merchant used and stuff like that. But before he was station master at Blairgowrie, he'd been station master at Inchtua, and she knew the story of the demise of the Inchture tramway, which some of you may remember ran from Inchture station to Inchture village. And had a horse-drawn Calais carriage, and apparently the Inchture tramway was taken up at the beginning of the First World War with the intention it would be relayed on the Western Front as part of the munitions supply rail there. And a squad turned up from the Remy or whoever did these things in the First World War, took it all up and parked it in wagons. It went off, it was loaded in a ship, and the ship was bombed in Zeebrugge, I think, and went down with the with all the track in it, and was never salvaged or anything. So the Inchture tramway is actually sat on the bottom of the North Sea now. But yeah, she was lovely, Lady May, and I used to visit her quite often when I used to get to Blairgowrie more often than I have done in recent years. And again, if you have any connections with the Caledonian Railway Association, I did do an obituary on her when she died a few years ago, because she had a railway career of all of her own. Apart from working at Blairgowrie, she worked at Perth in various functions and did relief goods clerking at various Caledonian stations as well. Lovely lady.
Tony, are there any artefacts left of Blairgowrie nowadays? Is it all disappeared under the Tesco supermarket?
Well, the last time I was there, the engine shed was still there, and I have no reason to believe it's still not there, but it's in much modified form, because when I first went there in the 1970 and 71, it was a shell. It was just the building, and all the windows had been broken out and the doors were off of it. And I've got some photographs of it in that state. But the site was turned into an industrial estate, as you probably know, but the Perth County Council acquired the engine shed site, and they actually converted the building into a garage for their health department, and they knocked in one wall to give access for vehicle, to park vehicles inside the building. And that was the way it was. Still 4 years ago was the last time I visited there. It was still in that use, and still as intact as it could be. The only other building was still there then, but has probably gone now, was an old stable building by the what had used to be the station entrance. And I think that probably dates from 1855, and that was actually used latterly by one of the coal merchants as a stable, and then a shed.
Can I ask you, Tony, have you contacted the libraries in Dundee for any information?
Jim, I don't know if any of you know Jim Page, but I've known Jim Page in Dundee for many years, and Jim has done a lot of research in Dundee on my behalf, really. Right. And if anybody saw my article on the 1894 rebuilding of the station, had a series of drawings that came from the Dundee Courier that he discovered and passed on to me, and they were included with that article.
The reason I'm asking was when I was at Art College, I did a thesis on the Dundee and Newtown Railway, and it was just part of my, one of the things that we did at college. And I was sent down to the libraries there, and there had been a chap who had a coffee or tea shop in Dundee, and he kept all the local newspapers, and particularly was interested in the railways. So from the very first railway including the Dundee and Newtown, of course, up till much later on in the century. You had all the opening days, for example, of all the railways roundabout, Dundee, Arbroath, etc. And he had kept all these things. And when he died, he passed them on to the libraries service. And they had all sorts of things, including Dundee and Newtown, Locoman's booklets on how to work the engines and how to, what the rules of the railway were and all sorts of stuff like that. They had collected, obviously, from people that came in to his coffee shop. So it went far beyond just the newspapers. The Courier, the Advertiser, of course, way back. And eventually I handed my thesis into the college and it was graded. I never got my thesis back. You don't. However, some years later, there was a publication put out by Dundee Museums people, all about Dundee and Newtown Railway. And it was actually word for word my thesis.
Really?
I had no idea how it got to them, but obviously it did eventually.
Yeah,
and chunks of that have now been used in various books, including the one that you mentioned. It's funny how life is.
Yeah, I've never been a great collector of artifacts. I haven't got out of my way, and the distance has always been a problem there, because I always remember we lived in London when I first started modelling Blairgowrie, and it was actually 505 miles from our flat in London to Blairgowrie station. Right. But I was talking about this before. Can anybody see that chair in the background?
Yes.
I can't turn up the light very much here now, but that is it's actually a Caledonian chair, although it's got LMS carved in the top of it. And that was May Simpson's chair in the goods shed at Blairgowrie, and came to me via her. So her son discovered that in her garage after she passed away, and wrote to me and said, was it worth anything? So I said, well, in its current state, it will probably fetch sort of 20 or 30 pound on the market then. So I said, I'll give you that much for it. He said, well, if you can come up and get it, you can have it, So I did arrange by Jim Page, actually. He bought it halfway down to one of the Scale 4 Norths at Wakefield, and I picked it up from him then and got it here. And I've had it restored, and it's a bit difficult to show you, but I don't know what the original seating was, but I've got a sort of blue and silver on it, which I think was probably the upholstery colours for Caledonian first class carriages. So the only other Blairgowrie artifacts, I did get some paperwork and stuff from May Simpson. The other thing I've got is the BR door plates for the station master and parcel office. Those were the only ones that left at the station when I got to it. And yeah, now I'm starting to think about it. One of the years I went up there, all the buildings and that were open to the public. It wasn't sort of kind of left locked up. And somebody had got into the loft and been through the paperwork up there. As I know some enthusiasts have done, but also some yobs have done somewhere. And the booking hall was absolutely littered with old paperwork. One of the things I did find in that was a file of correspondence with letters from Edinburgh office to the station master, and his carbon copies of his handwritten replies, all to do with the closure of the station. And I did manage to, I've still got that here, and that will be the basis of my very last article on Blairgowrie for the Caledonian true line, which will be the end of Blairgowrie, you know, because that's the only thing I've really got to write about anymore now. So I've done everything else as far as I can see. But the other thing I've got here, well, there's two things I can think of which need a lot of further work. I had a bundle of parcel way bills from May Simpson from Cooper Angus for 1904, and it probably represents about 6 months worth of parcels. And all these are just loose in a bundle. Now I've been through them, and I could sort them out and do a database with all the information that's contained on them. But the interesting thing at first view of going through those was the distant parts from which parcels came to Cooper Angus. You know, there's railway tickets on the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway, for example, and yeah, all over. The other thing I've got, you belong to the North British. Do you remember my article on Panmure sidings?
Oh yes, yes.
And that was based on some wagon books that Jim Page got, and I analysed the information for 12 months, and that was the basis of that article. But also what I acquired via John Young, who some of you will know for his Strathern Railways book, that also came out of the roof at Panmure, was I don't know what they're actually called now. I haven't looked at these for a long time, but I've got a whole pile here of dispatch notes, and these are from the 1880s. And really, you know, the only way to make sense of those is to go through them and make some kind of database of the information that they contain, and analyse that and write up something from it. So, yeah, a job for another time. I've got to finish this Oban bogey first.
That sounds like fun to get that finished.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to getting this other underframe development I mentioned. You know, I think that's going to work all right.
Jim Summers has got one, hasn't he?
Yeah, he ran that on my Blairgowrie at Keithbank Mills. That's the only 4 mil one I've ever seen. I've seen photographs of a couple of 7 mil ones, but they are difficult engines to model.
Absolutely. So, any other questions for Tony? Or are we getting to the stage where we'll call it a night, gents?
Yeah, we've had it. You've had your money's worth.
I think we've had more than our money's worth, Tony.
I'd just like to come in and say, Tony, thanks for a good talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
The other thing, I was a wee bit disappointed Mr. Summers hasn't joined us tonight.
Mr. Summers is having his birthday on the Waverley today.
Is that where he is?
Yes. So he apologises profusely, but he was dragged off by his family to celebrate his birthday.
I'm sure he will be looking at this. Because,
he's assured me that he's going to watch the recording.
He's one of the. I know Chris has seen it in real life many years ago, but Jim Summers has actually visited here a couple of years ago, so he's seen it in the real as well. So
yeah.
Well, I was just wanting to wish him a happy 80th birthday today, for Mr. Summers, but seeing as he's not there, I'll give him a phone call. But anyway, guys, thanks for this, and I'll leave you in good stead and stay safe.
Okay.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye, Richard.
So, Tony, you obviously put a lot of effort into preparing that, so thank you very much from all of us for
well, it's been a
going through all that trouble.
Yeah, it's been quite an interesting journey for me going back through some of this stuff, you know, thinking about the old days and so on, you know, because I can't really talk about my models without talking about the old days, because that's where a lot of them originate. So.
But it's good to see that so many of them have survived the test of time.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, gentlemen.
That's great. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll bid you all good
Thank you,
night.
Tony.
We'll see you
Thank you
very
for
soon.
listening.
No, thank you for doing it.
Thank you, Tony.
Take care.
Okay, good night,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right.